Hi everyone and welcome. We're about to go down to my wormery to go feed some of my worms. Actually, we're going to feed all of my worms, but before we go downstairs, as long as we're on the topic of feeding all my worms, I've also got some worms out here in my outdoor bin that I need to feed. And as you can see, I'm getting into the Halloween spirit here with some pumpkins, and you'll notice that one of these pumpkins doesn't look quite like the others. And I guess that's because I left it outside, and I left it for the squirrels to carve a jack-o'-lantern face into it, and that's what they came up with. How do you like that? Did a pretty good job. I guess it's, what, one big eye open, maybe another eye is closed and winking, big open mouth. I think the squirrels did a nice job making this jack-o'-lantern, but I don't want to leave it out here. I think I'm going to use it as worm food, so why don't we go ahead and feed it to the worms. So the last time we were out here and I was showing off my outdoor worm bin, you'll remember that I was covering up with that trash pail lid, and I've opted to allow for more daylight to get in, and that was because I was noticing a lot of worms cruising up, exploring, and I figured if there was maybe a little bit more daylight streaming in from above, then maybe it would deter the worms from climbing so much. So it's for that reason that instead of using that blue lid as a cover here, I'm leaving it for the most part uncovered. And that's also going to allow for a fair amount of moisture to enter the bin every time it rains, as it's doing now, or as it has been doing most of the day today. They've been talking about the rain tapering off soon, so maybe it'll start to dry out shortly, but I just figured I would start the feeding today here with this bin. And you can see some fairly fresh leaves in here. These are peppers. If you've been watching any of my gardening videos, then you'll know that I've been thinning out my garden every time I have a pepper plant or a tomato plant or something that stops giving up fruit or has run out of fruit. I'm not leaving the whole garden to be dismantled for the end. I'm just taking down plants one at a time as it's necessary to do so. And I did a slightly larger clearing of plants not too long ago, and I actually chalked that up as a feeding on my tracking spreadsheet for this worm bin. But I've not really been diligent about maintaining accurate records on all the feedings of this bin. I just kind of use it as a composter for when I've got garden waste, and then I, if I think it's the sort of stuff that the worms would like, I throw it in here. I think if you look in here carefully, if you look closely, let's get the camera in a little bit closer, you can see some of these different types of worms. They're actually black soldier fly larvae. You can see the regular worms cruising around all over the place, and they seem to dominate the population in this bin, but there also seem to be some black soldier fly larvae, and it's not surprising to see them just sort of sitting there stagnant, because they don't really do so good in the cold. I believe optimal temperature for them is 80 and above, so they might still be alive, but they're really slowed down a lot as the temperature drops. And originally I started to get a little bit worried, thinking that this bin was going to get overrun by black soldier fly larvae, and then I just decided in the end that we're going to leave them to be, and just to be helpers in the composting process here, and keep my red wigglers and European night crawlers company. So the pumpkin that I'm adding isn't very big, but I do want to make a little divot for it, and it also gives us a nice reason to kind of pick down through here a little bit and see how the compost is progressing and how the worms are doing, and just to see what sort of a ratio we have of black soldier fly larvae to regular composting worms. It does seem to me like we've got predominantly composting worms doing the work in here. That was kind of what I was hoping for, so I'm glad to see that. And people have questioned, what am I going to do with this bin once the temperature drops? And I'm expecting a day coming up in the near future, in the next few days as a matter of fact, when the temperature is supposed to drop down around 30 overnight. So I'll admit I'm a little bit concerned, so I might have to come up with some sort of a method for keeping this bin from freezing over and killing off all these wormies. So have to give that some thought here. But in the meantime, they're going to have this pumpkin here to chow on. Hopefully they'll enjoy that. And as I begin dismantling my garden, I'll probably continue adding vegetable matter and leaves and plants for them to enjoy eating. But I think this pumpkin is going to be a significant enough of an addition to this bin that I will mark it on my tracking spreadsheet as a formal feeding for this bin. And then I guess we'll have to check in on it again coming soon. I guess if I do at some point in the near future, maybe in the next few days, do something to try to counteract the coming cold, maybe I'll do another video specific to this bin. But that's all I have for today outside. Let's go on downstairs and get to feeding my worms that are down in my wormery. Okay, so we're down here now in my wormery, and here's my bins that need to be fed. Some of them are bins, some of them are bags. It's kind of a mix now. I've been running VermiBags for a couple weeks now. This is the VermiBag Tote, and that's the VermiBag Mini over there. And these I'm really counting as my oldest bins anymore, because the contents of these actually stem back to the 26th of May. June, July, August, September, October, wow. So we're actually in excess of 5 months at this point with the night crawlers that are in these bags. And well, you know, a lot of times you might consider 5 months to be a long period of time, but that's assuming you're starting with mature, fully grown worms with big appetites. The populations of these VermiBags are actually night crawlers that were all hatched from cocoons. So when you go back to the May 26th day, on that day I placed unhatched worm cocoons into a bin. And at that point, little tiny baby worms started emerging and eating, and so yeah, they definitely didn't really have the composting sort of bandwidth or consumption capabilities of fully grown worms. And their numbers were fairly small too, so whatever compost they might have produced over the past 5 months is dependent on obviously their size and their quantities, both of which were rather small. But after 5 months, I would hope that they're kind of approaching the age where they could begin reproducing and, you know, expanding the size of their population. And hopefully by having moved them into these larger containers, that'll help too, because previously they were in relatively small planters. So like I usually like to do, why don't we begin with the oldest of my bins, and we'll start with the VermiBag Mini. I'll drag that container a little bit closer to the camera so we can get a better view of it, and then we'll throw some food in there. So now the food that they're going to get today is pretty much commonplace. My normal feedings usually include coffee grounds, which you see in here, as well as something that I've been omitting for the past few weeks, which is bedding. So I've got a box of leaves here for them. Pretty good healthy size mix of vegetables here and fruits over here of all different types. The grit that I use is pulverized eggshell here in this little baby food jar. And a little bonus for them, a whole bunch of rolls that have gone stale. These are compliments of a friend of mine who's actually a relative of the family, my brother-in-law's cousin. She's a stewardess, so these are straight from American Airlines. Airplane food that's been sitting around so long it just got stale and dry, so they're going to be given to the worms. Alright, let's get to work. So the one thing we did notice for sure last time we were down here within the VermiBag Mini was that the level of illumination was very, very low. We were barely able to see what was happening because it was so dark here within the bin. So I've added some additional light overhead in the hopes that it'll help us better see what we're working on here. And I'll also do my best not to stand in the way of the light. So let's just start moving some of this leaf cover that's on top of the material aside to see what we can see. Previously I had actually taken all of this leaf cover out of the bin, but I'm going to see if I can somehow work around it and try not to remove it as part of the feeding. So down here we're actually starting to see some of the African night crawlers hanging around. I can't really remember what type of food they were given last time. I'm trying to see if I can spot any signs of residual bits and pieces of the last feeding. I can't tell if this is vegetable matter or paper. I believe it's just paper, but I could be wrong. This actually, no, this looks like a piece of maybe potato skin, which is often one of the items that they get fed. So that might be a little bit of leftover potato. What's this? This is a stem of a banana, which naturally does take a little bit longer than the banana peels themselves. But other than that, I'm not really noticing any other food bits in here. Well, it seems like the African night crawlers are doing a pretty decent job of working their way through the feedings that they've been getting. If I poke down a little bit lower, I think we're finding what might be cantaloupe rinds, a little bit of leftover cantaloupe rinds. So there's signs of the last feeding remaining in here. But if you ever watch my channel, you'll always know that I like not to wait until the food supply runs out. I always like to maintain a pretty good backfill on the feedings. And now, just a quick observation here too. This worm, you could see, has already developed this little bulge on the midsection of his body, clitellum or whatever it's called. Just that's a sign that they're at a mature enough age to breed, which is one thing that I had not noticed previously, and I've kind of gone looking for it here and there, just to, out of curiosity, to see if there's any likelihood of these worms being at that age yet, that they might actually begin reproducing soon. So that's a good sign. I'm happy to see that, because like I mentioned earlier, these worms were all hatched from cocoons 5 months ago, and I was a little bit unsure of how long it might take for them to reach maturity, reproductive age. So maybe at this point I can start expecting to see their population starting to grow a little bit more. Okay. Down into the bottom, I'm just going to put a fresh handful of dry leaves. And I guess for that matter, I could have probably just used what's out here surrounding the feeding zone, and then just gone for a handful of stuff at the end to cover up with. But you can see I'm throwing in a couple of these rolls for them to eat. Hopefully they'll like that. A little bit dry though, so I'm going to make sure that there's some more damp type stuff surrounding these dry bits of food. So I'm going to take these fairly nice sized cabbage leaves, and I'm going to wrap up these pieces of bread in leafy matter, so that as it thaws, and it's been down here thawing for a while now, I didn't want to start with completely frozen food scraps. I thought there might be some benefit to allowing them to thaw out a little bit in advance. Then we go for some fruity food. And it does seem like they're doing a pretty good job consuming what they've been given in the previous feedings. I mean, we see scraps here and there, but it does seem like they're making their way through the portions I've been giving them. So I'll assume that a portion about this size would be adequate for them. On top, I'm going to throw the coffee like I usually do, as well as a little bit of the grit that I also add during feedings nowadays, if I don't forget. So I like what I'm seeing here. The material has a pretty good moisture content to it, maybe a little bit drier than what I've been seeing in recent times, now that the winter weather is starting to come in, now that the hot, humid days of summer have ended. The drier days are upon us. So all summer long, I just felt like I was dealing with overly damp material in my bins. So I welcome a little bit drier conditions in my bins now that the colder weather is approaching. All right, so let's zipper this bag up and let the worms get back to work on what they were doing here. Okay, so next on our list is the VermiBag Tote, which is where we've been keeping the African night crawlers. So the previous bin was the European night crawlers. These are the African night crawlers. These are the only night crawlers that I have in my worming population. Everything else that I compost with is red wigglers, and has always been since day one, just up until more recently that I've started using this bin. And as the name of the bag suggests, the VermiBag Tote was originally designed to rest within a sort of like a Rubbermaid tote or a Husky tote, one of those plastic containers that a lot of people do their composting in. But this was really designed to rest within one of those. So I opted just for the other option of creating a wooden frame for it. And its main benefit of having a wooden frame versus being suspended within a tote is just a little bit more airflow. So I figured, since I'm going to adopt, the use of one of these bag systems, which increased airflow is one of the main selling points of it, I figured I would try to maximize that capability of it and get the most amount of airflow by building a wooden frame around it, so that it really gets a lot more air than it would if it was suspended within a tote or a bin. So just it's interesting because you'll have to bear with me as I deal with the night crawlers. I'm accustomed to composting with red wigglers, which are a smaller breed of worm. So the night crawlers are kind of new to me. The African night crawlers are, I believe, a slightly larger type of worm than the European night crawlers. The European night crawlers, I believe, are pretty closely related to the red wigglers. But I believe at some point these African night crawlers are supposed to grow pretty large in size. And that is the one thing I'm noticing right off the bat, is that some of these worms are a little bit bigger than what I'm accustomed to, since I've always been a red wiggler type of a composter. So I'm just still growing accustomed to having a slightly larger type of worm in my colony. And I can definitely see, the potential of these growing big. But they might have been slowed in their growth a little bit by being sort of in a cramped environment, in a small space, by being confined to the limited space that was within those pink pots that they were in up until just recently. So this is the first chance that they've had to sort of have a slightly greater area to roam around in, and hopefully that'll result in larger worms. So now, as we saw earlier in the European nightcrawler bin, here we have another African nightcrawler that seems to be exhibiting signs of the clitellum growing on it, which means maybe my African nightcrawlers here are also on the verge of reaching their mature age of being able to reproduce. Such a long worm. Like I said, I'm not used to composting with these night crawlers, so I'm just sort of taking the time here to familiarize myself with what I've got now. So let's do what we talked about in the last bin. We'll actually use some of this old leafy material here as our bedding for this feeding. And then I could just use some of the fresh leaves that I've got in the box to sprinkle on top of the container. Here we have one of the signs of the previous feeding, which is a banana stem with the main chunk of the stem up here on top that other bananas were hanging off of, so it's even harder than the regular stem. Might take them a little bit longer to consume that, but I'm in no hurry. Even though these two VermiBags are technically the oldest bins, like I said, these were started with small populations of cocoons only, so I'm not really treating them as technically taking longer or anything like that than what I'm accustomed to. I'm just giving them whatever amount of time they require to get to the point where we can start considering harvesting. Alright, so that's a fairly large worm, but I don't see any signs of the clitellum on that one. Alright, so good deal. Let's just grab a few more of these leaves to throw down underneath the food that we're going to add. And let's get to feeding. Once again, we're going to give these guys a couple nice rolls. A little bit dry. We're going to be sure to throw in some nice moist thawing vegetables around them to draw the moisture. Vegetables and fruits. I've got all different kinds of stuff today. A whole variety of different food items for them to enjoy. And it even does include a few sort of things that I normally don't add much. You know, I try to stay away from citrus, but figured what the heck, you know, in small portions mixed with other stuff, I don't think it's going to be a problem. But, you know, typically citrus type foods are treated as a no-no for your worm bins. So, just going to add in the coffee grounds. As well as a little bit of grit. Been trying to become more generous on the divvying out of grit for my worms. So, yeah, I'm gonna use fresh leaves, I think, to cover up with here. Because usually I'll try to, you know, reserve the use of fresh leaves on the top of my bins for the newer bins that I have. But I'm not gonna really treat this as a very old or mature bin, because it does still seem to me like the worms are only just now starting to get to that mature stage of their lives. So I'm just going to keep trying to make this into a nice cozy environment for them. Give them a nice leafy cover over the top. Okay. One thing I've seen people using in these bins is bubble wrap, which I guess probably helps a lot in terms of keeping moisture levels within the bin higher. But in a similar sort of way, I'm trying to keep the moisture inside a little bit differently. This is just my marker to show where I'm feeding, which is just something I normally do. So I'm just keeping the piece of paper on top to try to keep the moisture levels in the bin comfortable for the worms. But like you can see, the screen here allows for a fair amount of moisture to evaporate out. So to try to tune that, I've been using a little bit, I've been using this little piece of cardboard as sort of something to prevent all of that moisture from being able to evaporate out of the container. So I didn't want to completely cover the mesh, the screen here. I just figured a little bit of cover might help keep the moisture levels within the bin a little bit more comfortable for the worms. So, all right, that's our African night crawlers in the VermiBag tote. Let's get on to the rest of our bins, the red wigglers in the plastic bins. All right, so it would appear that I have once again fat-fingered my camera, and I put myself into the wrong mode, so I actually missed the footage on the first red wiggler bin that I just got done feeding, the oldest of my red wiggler bins, which is only a month and a half old, so it's not really that old. But yeah, unfortunately I totally missed all of that, and it wasn't that much to see. It was just one of my more heavily populated red wiggler bins, so we gave it a nice generous feeding, and we're still left with 2 of my red wiggler bins to be fed. So hopefully I won't screw up the footage on these. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. What I'm seeing here is very similar to what we saw in the last bin. And as a matter of fact, the 2 bins are very close in age. The bin that I just fed, which we missed, was dated September 13th, and this one is dated September 30th. So they're only about 2 weeks difference in their ages. The other bin being just a little bit more mature than this one. But both of them, as I recall, being pretty heavily populated. So we're likely to see that most of the food they were given last time is gone by now. So here's a banana peel. And in the last bin, since we missed it, that was pretty much all we found anyway. It was about 2 banana peels, and everything else appears to have been consumed. So they're doing a great job on eating up the food that they've been allotted. And over the past 8 days, which is the last time they received food, they did manage to consume everything that they were given. So we'll do the same here. We'll just gradually peel back some of the finished compost, and at the same time examine the material to see if there's any traces of the food that they received previously. So far, other than this banana peel, I've seen nothing. I see a little bit of cardboard, hacked up cardboard here and there. But not much of it. A little bit of newspaper here. Oh no, this is actually a piece of cantaloupe rind that's got that distinctive look to it, but it definitely has no more of the meaty melon fruit material on it. It's just been stripped down to a fairly thin skin. So there's really not a whole lot left of that as well. Yep, that's what this is too. Cantaloupe rinds definitely have that distinct appearance to them. So they're doing a good job. There's really not much left. It just looks like paper. I was able to easily confuse it with the paper scraps that are in here as bedding. So other than that one stem of a banana and those couple pieces of very paper thin cantaloupe rinds, I don't see any other traces of the food that they were given previously. Just a whole bunch of worms hanging out down here, enjoying the food. So there is still a little bit of bedding material down here. A couple pieces of cardboard here and there. But as you start to peel it back, you find that it's really more worms hanging out beneath it. So you can see that they really do enjoy the bedding material to hang out in and around and under. But it is fairly depleted, so I'm going to have to replenish the bedding, I believe. And I think we've already observed that in the past few weeks. Past few feedings, I've been not adding bedding, but on each occasion noticing that it was due for a bit more bedding. So that's why I've got the leaves here. And this is the same thing we did to the last bin, the bin that I screwed up on and didn't capture the footage with. We examined it right down to the very bottom, saw that there were only a very few number of remaining pieces of bedding, a few pieces of cardboard and newspaper remaining, so we supplemented it with some leafy matter, like we're going to do here. And it's a pretty nice amount. They're probably going to appreciate that. And then we'll just go ahead and we'll give them some food. Now I'm going to give this one 3. And that'll leave 2 for the last bin that needs to be fed. Because this bin definitely has a lot of worms in it. Maybe even a little bit more than the last bin that we saw. Although that last bin had a fair number of worms in it as well. So besides giving them a generous portion of bread, I'm also going to go generous on the food as well. Maybe I'm being so generous because I just saw the crazy worm lady add like tons and tons of food to her bins. But I do believe she's been preoccupied with a new puppy and with being a little bit under the weather, so her bins have actually been neglected a little bit. recently, so maybe that was the main reason she fed so generously. But I'm not worried. I'm not worried about my worms because I think my worms are going to handle this feeding quite nicely. I think they're going to burn through it pretty good. So if I come back another 8 days from now, I'm fairly certain that we're not going to see a whole lot of this remaining. So I've left just enough food to provide a similar feeding to the last of my bins. But since that last of my bins I know does not have as huge a population as these last two that I just fed, that's this one and the one that I did not capture the footage of, I didn't save quite as much food for that last bin. But it's going to be a nice healthy feeding, so they'll be happy with that. And this being a somewhat newer bin, September 30th, it's only a month old, so it's the way that a month-old bin in my wormery normally looks, with some fairly unfinished leaves and stems of leaves everywhere. And as time progresses, it'll get broken down across the top of the surface, and I'll eventually leave the top of the surface to be a better indicator of how the whole bin's coming along, with mostly just castings across the top. So, all right, let's get this one covered up and get the last of my bins out here to be fed. All right, so this bin is fairly light, which is typical for a new bin. Once a bin's been around for quite a while, and even though it has the same level as this bin, it would be much, much heavier because it's all castings. And castings just seem to have a real dense structure, so an equal amount of castings in a container like this will just be maybe twice the weight. It'll be twice as heavy. So the newer of my bins are usually quite light and quite fluffy, still consisting mainly of just worms and some fairly loosely packed material, bedding and food items, but that changes over time. And a bin this size can actually grow quite heavy. That's why I always wonder how people with those really large totes manage, because I can only imagine how heavy one of those things must get once it really starts to get mature and full. Although it must be nice having a fair amount of space in them like they do. But I think that these bins have just enough space in them as well. Alright, so I'm just going to keep peeling back the middle section, which is where they would have gotten the last feeding. And, you know, this being the newest of my bins, and the bin that I believe to have the least number of red wigglers in it, I've been using this as the bin to put my baited worms into, the worms that I've baited out of my finishing tub. I've got one tub of finished compost that I believe was harvested with a fair number of straggler worms in it. So I've been giving that bin a little bit of time to not only dry off and let the castings become a little bit drier and flakier and less muddy, but I'm also attempting to bait the worms out of those castings to reintroduce those worms to their cousins in here and keep them in my population, as opposed to allowing the castings to go out into the garden full of worms. So, well, I'll use a stick. I guess the stick will eventually break down. But down here in the middle, we're going to see a coffee filter. And this coffee filter was used as sort of the stage to dump out the contents of my baiting system. I got this little baiting box sort of going on. So I pulled out all the remaining food bits in that baiting box and laid them out on this coffee filter so that we could see how many worms we were able to congregate. And these might actually still be some of those worms that came over from the baiting attempt of my finished compost in the other tub. Or it might just be worms from the bin that came in to help share some of the food that came over with them. Because when I took that baiting, the contents of that baiting container out, I took out not only the worms but the food that they were baited with. So there was a little bit of leftovers that came over. But it does seem like whatever remains of the the coffee filter that they came over in is pretty minimal, so they've been eating that as well. It's probably nice and easy to eat. It's paper, you know, coffee filter material is just an organic, pulpy material, and especially if it gets drenched with delicious juices of melon, then I can see the worms wanting to just nibble at that and make an easy meal of it. Alright, so as we approach the bottom, I'm just going to try to inspect how the bedding material here on the bottom is looking, how it's holding up. Because this is a new bin, fairly new bin, the newest of my bins as a matter of fact. October 14th. So today's the 29th, so this is only a couple weeks old. This would only be maybe the second or third feeding for this bin. So the need for fresh bedding in this bin might not be as much as the last two bins that we checked in on. As you can see, there's a fair amount of cardboard and newspaper down in here for them to occupy and for them to travel through. It's like a nice medium for them to hang out in underneath the feeding zone. So I'm questioning whether I should supplement the bedding in here as part of their feeding. It might not be necessary, but you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. Because I've kind of, you know, turned up what they've got already, but I don't see any harm in giving them a little bit more. We'll just throw in a little bit of leafy matter, maybe not as much as we gave the last bin, just to supplement the bedding. Because the bedding also acts as food for them. And it also helps balance out the nitrogen-rich food that I typically feed. Just kitchen scraps and stuff like that, coffee grinds, all high nitrogen content. So we'll start with these last couple pieces of bread. We'll take what remains in this container of vegetable and fruit scraps. Give them the last of it. Looks to be a pretty nice, generous feeding. I'm sure they'll do just fine with it. Let's see how many coffee grounds remain in this container here. Not too many, but they look kind of damp. Hopefully I can get them all to come loose, become part of this feeding. Yep. Spread them out. And then top the whole thing off with some grit, which is always helpful for digestion. Alright, so there's really not much left to do here. All I got to do is cover up and clean up. Get all this stuff back up onto the shelf, let these little guys get back to work and do their thing. So yeah, let's try to get this leaf cover back out across the top and keep things level. Since it is kind of my measure of how things are progressing in the bin. Very nice. All right. So that's it for today, everybody. Let's get things cleaned up here, but I won't keep you around for that. That's boring. I'll wash up and clean up around here, and that's it for today. Thanks for keeping me company. I appreciate you tuning in to watch my videos. So you know, one last thing you could do for me before you switch out is throw me a quick thumbs up. Show me that you liked the video if you did, and also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always really appreciated as well. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.